Welcome back to learning Revit structure. In this lesson, we'll cover placing vertical structural columns. Now, there are two types of columns inside of Revit: your normal architectural columns and structural columns. Structural columns contain more information that relates to the actual structure, where the architectural column is primarily just an aesthetic or architectural element, but not necessarily load-bearing. So how do we go about placing structural columns? Well, first, you typically lay out a grid, and that's what we see on our screen. The grid actually intersects at the placement of where columns would be. So we create a grid first, and then place our columns at grid intersections. So to do this, let's go to the Structure tab on your ribbon. In the Structure panel, click Column. This will open up the actual structural placement tools on the ribbon on the right. The first option you have is choosing whether you want to place a vertical column or a slanted column. We'll just use vertical. And right now you're going to place a column at a single instance, meaning at any intersection of a grid or grid lines. You can also say at grids, meaning I can place multiple columns at once. You could also place a structural column inside an architectural column if one already existed. And the last option is to tag the column on placement, meaning it produces a tag automatically, or you can always come back and tag it later. Now, the options bar below that asks you some information about the placement. One is, after you place a column, do you want to rotate it? If yes, click the check mark and it'll ask you to rotate it as soon as you place it. The second option is a drop down for depth or height, meaning do you want this column to be drawn below the current level or above the current level? I'm going to set this to height. And then the height is how high up from the current level do you want to draw this column? Up to the next level, in this case level 2, or unconnected, meaning I can specify the actual distance or height this column is drawn. Let's leave it set to level 2. Now, the type of column you're going to add, I can look at it in the properties area on the left. We're going to use the W-wide flange column W10 by 49. And I can see the information or properties below: the actual material it uses, the structural types, dimension data, and also the data image for identity. Now, if you click Edit Type, you see more information for this column, the structural elements, those dimensional values, and the identity data as well too. Now, if you wanted to modify this, recommendation would be to duplicate this column type, give it a new name, and then modify the duplicate, keeping the original. Click Cancel on this box. Now, if you need to load in a new column, structural columns are treated as families. So on the ribbon, you could click Load Family. When you click Load Family, Revit will open up to its default library location. And here we can start to look for the different structural elements, such as structural columns. Scroll down to Structural Columns, double-click to open the folder, then double-click the Steel folder, and then I can look at one of these different types of columns that I could bring in. In this case, let's double-click the HSS Hollow Structural Column, and what it will do now is open a table asking us which one or ones of these different types of columns do we want to bring in. And you can see there's a lot. So technically, you're not going to load all of these because it does take up space. So if you wanted to bring in more than one, you can hold the Control key and simply select multiple elements, or columns in this case, that you want to load in. Just click OK and it loads them into the current project. However, for this example, let's just click Cancel, because we're going to use the W-wide flange column W10 by 49. Now, since we're placing one column at a time right now, all I have to do is move my mouse to an intersection of two grid lines. So I could zoom in and I can see it'll snap to that intersection, just left click. Now, if I turn Tag on Placement on by checking the checkbox and click at one of the intersections, I can see it places the column and tags it. Turning off the Tag on Placement turns it off. If you check mark Rotate after placement on the options bar, placing a column will now ask me to rotate the column as soon as you place it. Uncheck marking it will turn it off. Now, let's say you want to place multiple columns by selecting multiple grid lines. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to select the At Grids in the multiple area. Now, what Revit is going to ask you to do is to pick at least two intersecting grid lines. So I'll zoom in to show this. I can select one grid line, and then another grid line, and the column is placed at that intersection. Or you could window in multiple grid lines. And I could do this from dragging a window right to left, selecting multiple grid lines. And as you select those grid lines and release the mouse, you can see all of the columns appear. To save the columns, simply click Finish on the ribbon. This will add the columns. To exit out of the column command, click Modify in the upper left. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at placing vertical structural columns. We talked about the difference between an architectural column and a structural column, and then we looked at placing these structural columns on grids. We could place them one at a time, choosing 2 grid lines to place the column at the intersection, rotating and tagging if we want after we place the column. And then we looked at creating multiple columns at once by selecting multiple grid lines.